The day I lost everything started with a misplaced phone. Not mine, his. My father's smartphone, accidentally left on his desk while he rushed to a crucial business meeting. I wouldn't have touched it, except it kept buzzing with notifications that seemed urgent. That's when I saw them, the messages from Martina. My name is Lucille, and until that moment, I was the pampered daughter of one of Boston's most successful tech entrepreneurs. The messages made my stomach turn. Intimate photos, plans for their weekend getaway, discussion of their future together, and what they'd do with my trust fund. Daddy's little princess won't need all that money anyway, Martina had written. She's too naive to know what to do with it. My father's response, once we're married, we'll put it to better use. She'll understand eventually. I was still staring at the phone when he returned to his office. Sweetheart, what are you doing here? His voice carried that familiar warmth, but now it felt like poison. I held up his phone. Who's Martina? The color drained from his face. That's private. Private like the trust fund you're planning to steal from me? My voice cracked. Private like your affair? You had no right to look at my messages. His warmth vanished, replaced by cold fury. This is exactly why you're not ready for responsibility. You're still a child who doesn't understand boundaries. Don't you dare turn this around on me. I slammed the phone onto his desk. Does Mom know? His silence was answer enough. I'm telling her everything, I said, turning toward the door. If you do that, you'll regret it. His voice was steel. Everything you have, your apartment, your car, your lifestyle, it all comes from me. Think carefully about your next move. I faced him again. Are you threatening me? I'm stating facts. You're 25, Lucille. What can you possibly do on your own? The next few hours became a blur. I called Mom, told her everything. By evening, security was escorting me out of the building. My key card, deactivated. My company email, deleted. My trust fund, gone, transferred to Martina's account hours after our confrontation. That night, I sat in my expensive apartment, knowing I had days before the automatic rent payment would bounce. My phone buzzed with a text from Yosef, my best friend since college. Heard what happened? Need a place to crash? I stared at my designer furniture, my walk-in closet full of clothes I couldn't afford to keep. Yes, I typed back. And maybe a job lead? My cousin's cafe is hiring. It's not glamorous, but it's something. 3 days later, I was living in Yosef's spare room, wearing a coffee-stained apron and learning how to make lattes. My father's wedding announcement to Martina made the business news. They looked perfect together, the successful entrepreneur and his younger, equally ambitious bride. Your order, ma'am? I asked a customer, forcing a smile. Triple shot vanilla latte, extra hot, she said, not looking up from her phone. It was Patricia, though I didn't know it then. She'd become important later, but at that moment, she was just another customer who didn't see me. That night, counting my tips and researching business schools I might be able to afford, I made a promise to myself. I would take back everything, not through Daddy's money or connections, but through my own power. I'd make him regret the day he underestimated me. You okay? Yosef asked, finding me still awake at 2 a.m. No, I admitted, but I will be. I'm applying to business school. With what money? I showed him my laptop screen, student loans, scholarship applications, part-time program options. I'll figure it out. I have to. You know this won't be easy, right? I thought about Martina's message. She's too naive to know what to do with it. Good, I said, typing another application. I'm done with easy. It's time they learned what I'm really capable of. The cafe's morning shift started in 4 hours. I'd be exhausted, but that didn't matter. Every coffee I served, every dollar I saved, every late-night study session, They were all steps toward my goal. My father thought he'd broken me, but he'd only succeeded in setting me free. Now I had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Let them think I'm defeated. Let them believe I've disappeared into obscurity. They'll never see me coming until it's too late. 6 months into business school, and I was already drowning in coursework. Between morning shifts at the cafe, evening classes, and late-night study sessions, sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford. But I was making it work. Barely. "You look like death warmed over," Yosef said, sliding a fresh coffee across his kitchen counter. "Thanks. Just what every girl wants to hear." I grabbed the coffee and my laptop. "I've got a presentation in corporate finance in 2 hours, and I still need to polish the slides." "The one about hostile takeovers?" I smiled despite my exhaustion. "The irony isn't lost on me." My phone buzzed, a news alert about my father's company. The stock had jumped 15% after announcing a merger with Martina's tech consulting firm. I forced myself to read the whole article, noting every detail. "Still tracking them?" Yosef asked, peering over my shoulder. "Know your enemy," I muttered, then caught his concerned look. "What?" "Nothing. Just don't lose yourself in this, okay?" Before I could respond, my phone rang. Patricia, the regular from the cafe who'd become something of a mentor after discovering I was in business school. "Lucille, are you sitting down?" Her voice crackled with excitement. "Remember that summer internship program I mentioned? A spot just opened up. It's yours if you want it." My heart raced. Patricia's venture capital firm was exactly where I needed to be. "When do I start?" "Next week. But fair warning, it's full time. You'll have to quit the cafe." I glanced at my bank account on my laptop screen. The numbers were already tight. "I can't afford to." "It's paid," she cut in, competitively. "And before you protest about fairness, you earned this. Your proposal for restructuring that failing startup last month? Brilliant." After hanging up, I turned to Yosef. "I got it, the internship at Walsh Ventures." He hugged me. "See, things are turning around." I need to go shopping, I realized, looking down at my coffee-stained jeans. I can't show up looking like a barista. "I know just the place," he grinned. "Discount Designer Boutique. My sister swears by it." That afternoon, armed with 2 new business suits and a confidence I hadn't felt in months, I walked into my corporate finance class. Professor Adams was discussing merger strategies when my classmate Sarah poked my arm. "Isn't that your dad's company?" she whispered, pointing to the projection screen. There it was, a case study on successful modern mergers, featuring my father's latest triumph. My hands clenched under the desk. "Ms. Craig," Professor Adams called out, "since you seem interested in this particular case, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on the merger strategy?" The class turned to look at me. They knew who I was, or rather, who I used to be. I stood, my voice steady. "The merger appears successful on paper, but there are concerning patterns in the quarterly reports. The acquired company's valuation seems inflated, and the projected synergies are optimistic at best." Professor Adams raised an eyebrow. "Interesting perspective. Care to elaborate?" For the next 5 minutes, I detailed everything wrong with my father's merger. Every weakness, every potential point of failure. When I finished, the room was silent. "Exceptional analysis," Professor Adams said finally. "Have you considered a career in corporate restructuring?" After class, Sarah caught up with me. "That was incredible. How did you know all that?" "Let's just say I pay attention to details." I checked my phone. An email from Patricia about orientation details. "Hey," Sarah said, "a bunch of us are getting drinks tonight to celebrate finishing midterms. Want to join?" I almost declined, my usual response to social invitations. But something stopped me. "You know what? Yes, I could use a break." That night at the bar, surrounded by classmates who knew me only as Lucille, the hardworking student, not Lucille, the disgraced heiress, I felt something shift. These people respected me for my mind, not my last name. To surviving midterms, Sarah raised her glass. And to new beginnings, I added, clinking glasses with the group. My phone buzzed again. Another news alert. My father's company had just announced Martina as their new chief strategy officer. The photo showed them together, smiling, her hand resting possessively on his arm. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, noticing my expression. I locked my phone, shoving it into my bag. "Perfect. Actually, I have a question about that venture capital internship I just landed." The pieces were falling into place. Every class, every connection, every late night studying. They were all steps toward my goal. My father had taught me well. In business, knowledge is power, and I was gathering both. My first day at Walsh Ventures started with a surprise. Patricia wasn't just any partner, she was the founding partner, and she had plans for me. "Your desk," she said, gesturing to a space near her office. "I want you close enough to learn." I set down my new laptop bag, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows and the Boston skyline beyond, a far cry from the cafe's cramped break room. "First task," Patricia continued. "We're reviewing pitches for a new AI startup accelerator. I want your analysis by lunch." As I dove into the work, a familiar face appeared at my desk. Shanice, the firm's rising star associate. "So, you're Patricia's new protege," she said, perching on my desk edge. "Heard about your corporate finance presentation. Gutsy move, criticizing that merger." I tensed. "You know who I am." "Please," she rolled her eyes. "I make it my business to know everything about everyone. Don't worry, your secret's safe. But I have a proposition for you." Before she could continue, commotion erupted near the reception area. My blood ran cold as I recognized the voices. "Martina, darling, the meeting's this way," my father's voice carried across the office. I ducked behind my monitor, but Shanice grabbed my arm. "Don't hide. You've done nothing wrong." They rounded the corner, my father in his usual tailored suit, Martina draped in designer wear that probably cost more than my yearly salary. They stopped cold when they saw me. "Lucille?" My father's face darkened. "What are you doing here?" "Working," I said, standing straight. "Like everyone else." Martina's perfectly painted lips curved into a smirk. "How quaint. From coffee shops to venture capital. Moving up in the world, aren't we?" "Ms. Delgado." Patricia's voice cut through the tension as she emerged from her office. "I see you've met my star intern. Lucille's analysis of your merger was particularly insightful." The color drained from Martina's face. My father's jaw tightened. "Patricia," he forced a smile, "I didn't realize you were mentoring new talent." "The best talent can come from unexpected places," Patricia replied smoothly. "Now, shall we discuss your funding request?" As they disappeared into the conference room, Shanice whistled low. "Okay, that was intense. You okay?" I realized my hands were shaking. "I need air." On the building's rooftop garden, Shanice handed me a coffee from the executive lounge. "So, about that proposition, I'm launching a tech startup. I need someone who understands corporate weaknesses and isn't afraid to exploit them. You want me to help you compete with my father's company?" "Better," she grinned. "I want us to build something that could eventually acquire it." I stared at her. "That's ambitious," says the girl who publicly dissected her father's merger strategy. "Look, I've got the technical expertise and industry connections. You've got the insider knowledge and the motivation. Together, we could be dangerous." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother, who I hadn't heard from in months. "Saw your father today. He's worried about what you might do. Be careful, sweetheart." I showed Shanice the message. Seems like I'm already dangerous enough. Good, she said, because this industry needs shaking up. You in? Back at my desk, I watched through the conference room's glass walls as Martina gestured animatedly about their expansion plans. Patricia caught my eye and gave a subtle head shake. The funding request wasn't going well. Rough meeting? I asked Patricia later as security escorted my father and Martina out. Let's just say their numbers didn't add up. She paused. You know, they're not as stable as they appear. The merger covered up some serious issues. I know, I said. That's why I'm joining Shanice's startup. Patricia's eyes sparkled. Good, because I'm gonna fund it. That evening, I sat in my new apartment, small but my own, paid for with my internship salary, and opened my laptop. On the screen, a business plan began to take shape. Not just any plan, but one that would target every weakness I discovered in my father's empire. My phone buzzed again, another text from Mom. Whatever you're planning, remember who you are. Don't let revenge change you. I thought about the girl I'd been a year ago, naive and trusting. She was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who understood that sometimes justice requires a strategic mind and a willingness to strike first. I won't let it change me, I texted back. I'll let it reveal me. Across the city, in their penthouse apartment, my father and Martina were probably discussing their failed funding meeting, unaware that their real problems were just beginning. They'd taught me an expensive lesson about trust and power. Now it was time to show them exactly how well I'd learned it. Your father's company just lost their biggest client, Shanice announced, bursting into our startup's new office space. 6 months had transformed our two-person operation into a team of 15, with Patricia's backing opening doors we'd only dreamed of. I looked up from my laptop. How bad? Bad enough that their stock dropped 12% in an hour. She pulled up the financial news on our conference room screen. Apparently, Martina's innovative strategy wasn't so innovative after all. Our own company, Phoenix Tech Solutions, had been quietly growing, specializing in the exact services my father's company was failing to provide. Every client they lost seemed to find their way to us, though few knew of my connection. Speaking of clients, Yosef called from his desk. I'd hired him as our operations manager the moment we could afford it. That pharmaceutical company you mentioned, they're interested in meeting. My phone rang. Patricia. Turn on CNBC, she said without preamble. Your father's giving a press conference. There he was, looking older than I remembered, with Martina by his side. Their usual confidence seemed strained. While recent setbacks have presented challenges, he was saying, we remain committed to our vision of innovation and excellence. Translation, Shanice snorted. They're in deep trouble and trying to stop investors from jumping ship. Did you see their quarterly report? I asked Patricia. Just finished reviewing it. They're one bad quarter away from a crisis. Your father's betting everything on a new security platform launch next month. I smiled. The one with the critical firmware flaw? How did you? Never mind, I don't want to know. But yes, that one. After hanging up, I found Shanice staring at me. You knew about the flaw? Let's just say I have reliable sources. I'd been cultivating relationships with former employees my father had discarded over the years. Amazing what people would share over coffee and sympathy. We could warn them, Yosef suggested, ever the voice of conscience. Like they warned me before stealing my trust fund? I shook my head. They made their choices. That afternoon, I had lunch with Mom at her favorite cafe. She looked better than she had in years, finally free from my father's shadow. I saw the news, she said, stirring her tea. He called me, asked if I knew anything about your new company. What did you tell him? That he should have thought about consequences before betraying his own daughter. She reached for my hand. Just promise me something. When you make your move, Make it clean. Don't drag it out like he did with us. Mom, don't pretend this isn't what you've been planning. I know you, Lucille. You're my daughter, but you're also his. You learned strategy at his knee. Back at the office, Shanice was waiting with more news. Their security platform? 3 major clients just backed out of pre-orders. Apparently, someone leaked information about potential vulnerabilities. What a shame, I said, not bothering to hide my smile. Any word on their stock price? Down another 8%. But here's the interesting part. Martina's been selling her shares. Quietly, but not quietly enough. I raised an eyebrow. Rats leaving the sinking ship? More like rats trying to cash out before the ship even starts taking on water. That evening, as I was leaving the office, I ran into Martina in the building's lobby. She'd aged in the past year, stress lines evident despite her expensive makeup. "Enjoying the view?" she asked bitterly, gesturing at the Phoenix Tech Solutions sign being installed above our office door. "Just admiring the results of hard work," I replied. "Something you might want to try sometime." "You think you're so clever," she hissed, stepping closer. "But you have no idea what you're dealing with." "Actually, I do. Tell me, does my father know you've been selling your shares? Or about the offshore account you've been funneling money into?" Her face went pale. "How did you—" "Like you said, I'm clever. Here's some free advice. Get out while you can. What's coming next won't be pretty." As she hurried away, my phone buzzed with a text from Shanice. "Meeting with their former lead developer tomorrow. Says he has something we need to see." I typed back, "Perfect timing." That night, I stood at my apartment window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, my father was probably in his office, trying to save his crumbling empire. He'd taught me that business was like chess, always think several moves ahead. What he hadn't taught me was that sometimes the best revenge isn't a single devastating blow, but 1,000 tiny cuts, each one precisely placed to cause maximum damage. The game was entering its final phase, and I had all the pieces exactly where I wanted them. "They're desperate enough to consider selling," Patricia announced, dropping a thick folder on my desk. "Your father's board is pushing for a buyout before the stock price falls any further." I flipped through the documents, financial reports, internal memos, everything we needed. "And you're sure about this?" 3 board members approached me personally. She smiled. "They have no idea you're involved with Phoenix. Your father's been keeping your success very quiet." Shanice burst into my office, laptop in hand. "Their security platform launch? Complete disaster. 2 major vulnerabilities discovered in the first hour. Their stock is in free fall." My phone buzzed. A text from Mom. "He's calling an emergency board meeting. It's time." I looked at Patricia. "How quickly can we put together a buyout offer?" "Give me 2 hours." The next few hours were a blur of meetings, calls, and paperwork. By evening, our offer was ready. Fair but firm, with conditions that would effectively remove both my father and Martina from any operational control. "Ready?" Shanice asked as we prepared to enter the conference room where my father's board was waiting. I straightened my jacket. I've been ready for this moment for 2 years. The room fell silent as we entered. My father's face went from confused to furious as he recognized me. "What is this?" he demanded. "This," I said, placing our offer on the table, "is your way out of the mess you've created." One of the board members, Harold, who'd known me since childhood, picked up the document. "Phoenix Tech Solutions. You're behind Phoenix?" "She's the CEO and majority shareholder," Patricia confirmed, stepping into the room, "and she's offering you a lifeline." Martina laughed, but it sounded hollow. "This is ridiculous. You can't seriously be considering an offer from—" "Your stock price has dropped 60% in 3 months," I cut in. "Your major clients are jumping ship. Your new platform is a security nightmare. And I turned to the board. Your CSO has been quietly selling her shares while telling everyone else to hold. The room erupted in chaos. Board members turned to stare at Martina, who had gone pale. This is a hostile takeover, my father snarled. No, I corrected him. This is karma. You taught me everything I know about business, remember? Including how to recognize when someone's vulnerable. Harold cleared his throat. The offer appears quite reasonable, actually. More than fair given our current situation. You can't be serious, my father started, but another board member cut him off. Israel, we need to consider this. The company won't survive another quarter like this one. I watched my father's face as reality sank in. He turned to Martina for support, but she was already gathering her things. I need to make some calls, she mumbled, hurrying from the room. She's running to move more money offshore, I announced to the room. You might want to freeze those accounts before she empties them completely. 2 hours later, the preliminary agreement was signed. My father sat alone at the conference table, staring at the papers. Why? He asked as everyone else filed out. You could have destroyed us completely. Why offer a buyout at all? Because I learned from your mistakes, I replied. You taught me that business is about power, but you forgot about legacy. This company was built by people who believed in it. They deserve better than watching it burn for your ego. And Martina? Already gone. She cleared out her office while we were signing the papers. Turns out she's been planning her exit strategy for months. He looked suddenly old, defeated. I lost everything. No, I corrected him. You threw everything away. There's a difference. Outside the conference room, Shanice was waiting with a bottle of champagne. We did it. Not yet, I said. We still have to fix everything they broke. But first, I pulled out my phone. I need to make a call. Mom answered on the first ring. Is it done? Yes. How would you like to come back as head of the charitable foundation? The one he pushed you out of? Her laugh was worth everything. Sweetheart, I thought you'd never ask. That night, as we celebrated in our office, Yosef raised his glass. To Phoenix rising from the ashes. To karma, Shanice added. To family, Mom said, squeezing my hand. I looked around at these people who had stood by me, who had believed in me when I had nothing. To second chances, I said, and to learning from our enemies. Somewhere across town, my father was probably sitting in his empty penthouse, wondering how his perfect world had crumbled so completely. But I wasn't thinking about him anymore. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, merging companies, rebuilding trust, creating something better from the ashes of his mistakes. For the first time in 2 years, revenge wasn't on my mind. The future was. The financial audit results are worse than we thought, Shanice said, spreading documents across my new office, my father's old office. Martina didn't just embezzle funds, she created an entire shadow accounting system. How bad? I asked, though the grim expressions around the conference table told me enough. 8 figures, Patricia replied, spread across various offshore accounts. The good news? We've frozen most of them. The bad news? The press got wind of it. Right on cue, my phone lit up with notifications. The story was breaking across all major business news outlets. Tech giant's former CSO accused of massive fraud. Your father's being questioned by the SEC, Yosef added, looking up from his tablet. They want to know how much he knew. Mom appeared in the doorway, looking concerned. Lucille, you need to see this. She handed me her phone. A video was playing. My father leaving the SEC building, surrounded by reporters. He looked haggard, destroyed. Mr. Craig, did you know about your wife's illegal activities? Was this connected to your daughter's takeover? Is it true Martina Delgado has fled the country? Turn it off, I said quietly. Despite everything, seeing him like this brought no satisfaction. There's more, Mom said. He's asking to meet with you. Says it's important. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what this meant. The first direct contact since the takeover 3 weeks ago. You don't have to see him, Shanice said protectively. Yes, I do. I stood up, set it up for this afternoon, in the small conference room. I'll be right outside if you need me, Yosef offered. The hours crawled by. At exactly 3, my father walked in, escorted by security. He'd aged years in weeks, his confident stride replaced by a weary shuffle. You wanted to see me? I kept my voice neutral. I need to tell you something. He sat heavily. About Martina, about everything. I already know about the fraud. No, he cut in. You don't know everything. When I met her, I was lost. Your mother and I were struggling, and Martina seemed to understand me, but she was playing me from the start. He pulled out a USB drive. This contains everything: bank records, emails, conversations she recorded. She was planning to use it against me if I ever turned on her. But you deserve to know the truth. I stared at the drive. Why are you giving me this? Because you won, he said simply. But more than that, you won fairly. You built something real while we were just creating illusions. I was blind, Lucille. Blind to what I had, blind to what I lost, blind to who you really are. And now? Now I'm facing federal charges. My wife has disappeared with millions, and my daughter. He smiled sadly. My daughter turned out to be smarter and stronger than I ever imagined. Before I could respond, Shanice burst in. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation. Martina's been found. Where? We both asked simultaneously. Singapore. Local authorities just arrested her trying to access one of the frozen accounts. They're extraditing her back to face charges. My father slumped in his chair. It's over then. Not quite, I said, picking up the USB drive. We still have to fix what you both broke. That evening, after the lawyers had gone through the drive's contents and added them to the mounting evidence, I found Mom in her new office. She was organizing plans for the foundation's relaunch. You okay? She asked, seeing my expression. I thought I'd feel different, I admitted. More satisfied, maybe. Instead, I just feel tired, she suggested. That's what revenge does, sweetheart. It takes more than it gives. My phone buzzed. A message from Patricia. Board approved your restructuring plan. Ready when you are. So, what now? Mom asked. I showed her the message. Now we rebuild, not just the company, but everything. We do it right this time. Later, walking through the quiet office, I passed my father's old photos, now replaced with our new team pictures. Shanice was organizing tomorrow's announcements. Yosef was finalizing the new organizational chart, and everywhere, people were working late not out of fear, but excitement for what we were creating. My phone buzzed again. An email from my father's lawyer. He was pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation against Martina. His last line read, "He wanted you to know first." Standing at the window where he used to stand, I watched the city lights flicker on. The empire he'd built had crumbled, but from its ashes, something stronger was emerging. Something built on truth, not lies, on collaboration, not fear. Ready to head out? Shanice called from the door. The team's grabbing dinner to celebrate the restructuring approval. I took one last look at the city. Yes, I said, turning away from the window. I'm ready. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when Martina arrived for her sentencing. I watched from my car as she climbed the stairs, designer outfit replaced by a modest suit, her face drawn and pale. You don't have to be here, Shanice said from the driver's seat. The lawyers can handle it. Yes, I do. I checked my phone, a message from my father's lawyer, 15 minutes until his testimony. Inside, the courtroom was packed. My father sat in the witness box, looking smaller than I remembered. When Martina entered, their eyes met briefly before both looked away. "You may proceed," the judge said. My father cleared his throat. "I met Martina at a tech conference in 2019. She presented herself as a successful consultant, but it was all fabricated. Her company existed only on paper." "And when did you become aware of her fraudulent activities?" the prosecutor asked. "After the merger. But by then," he glanced at me in the gallery, "I was too proud to admit I'd been conned, too ashamed to face what I'd done to my family for a lie." Martina's lawyer jumped up. "Objection. The witness is—" "Overruled," the judge cut in. "Continue, Mr. Craig." For the next hour, my father detailed everything: the fake contracts, the hidden accounts, the manipulated records. With each revelation, Martina seemed to shrink further into herself. During a recess, Mom found me in the hallway. "You're doing the right thing being here." "Am I?" Sometimes I wonder if I should have just walked away, started fresh somewhere else, and let them keep hurting people. She squeezed my hand. "You did what needed to be done." Back in the courtroom, Martina's lawyer was making a last-ditch attempt to paint her as a victim of circumstance. It wasn't working. "The defendant knowingly and systematically defrauded investors," the prosecutor countered. "She stole not just money, but trust." The judge's verdict was swift: 8 years, plus restitution. As they led Martina away, she stopped beside me. "I hope you're happy," she spat. "You've destroyed everything." "No," I replied calmly. "You did that yourself. I just exposed the truth." Outside, reporters swarmed around us. "Ms. Craig, how does it feel to see your former stepmother convicted? Will Phoenix Tech be able to recover the stolen funds? Any comment on your father's testimony?" Shanice stepped in, shielding me. "Ms. Craig has no comment at this time. Please direct all questions to our legal team." Back at the office, Yosef was waiting with updates. "Stocks up 12% since the verdict. Investors are calling it a new era of transparency." "And the restructuring?" I asked. "Ahead of schedule. The team's actually excited about the changes. Oh, and your father's lawyer called. He wants to know if you'll meet with him one last time before he reports to serve his reduced sentence." I hesitated. "Where?" "The old house. Tomorrow morning." The next day, I drove up to my childhood home. My father was in the garden, the place Mom had loved so much before everything fell apart. "Thank you for coming," he said, looking up from a rose bush. "I wanted you to have this." He handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter, dated the day before I discovered his affair. A letter to his lawyers, instructing them to transfer majority control of the company to me on my next birthday. "I was going to give you everything anyway," he said quietly. "Before Martina, before I lost my way. You were always meant to lead this company. Why show me this now? Because you deserve to know that I believed in you, even then. What you've built, how you've led. It's better than anything I ever did." "Dad, let me finish. I'm going away for 2 years. When I come back, I won't interfere. The company is yours, rightfully earned. Just take care of your mother, and maybe someday—" "Someday," I nodded, understanding the unspoken request for future forgiveness. That evening, I sat in my office, earned through work and determination, not given by birthright. Shanice and Yosef were arguing good-naturedly about the new project timeline. Mom was down the hall, revitalizing her foundation. Everything was different, yet somehow right. My phone buzzed, a text from Patricia. "Dinner tonight? We should discuss Phoenix's next chapter." I looked out at the city, the same view that had once represented my father's power. Now it represented possibility, potential, and most importantly, truth. "On my way," I texted back. The past was settled. It was time to focus on the future. The board meeting will begin in 5 minutes, Yosef announced, poking his head into my office. Everyone's waiting. I gathered my papers, pausing at the mirror to straighten my blazer. Through the glass walls, I could see the familiar faces filing into the conference room. Shanice, Patricia, Mom, and the board members who had stayed through the transition. Ready? Shanice asked, falling into step beside me. This is a big one. It's time, I nodded. They deserve to know. The room quieted as I took my place at the head of the table. These quarterly meetings had become a symbol of our company's transformation. Transparent, collaborative, focused on growth rather than power plays. Before we begin, I said, I want to share something personal. I pulled up a familiar image on the screen, the old company logo from my father's days. When I took over this company, many of you expected me to erase every trace of the past. But that would have been a mistake. Murmurs rippled through the room. Instead, we learned from it. We built something stronger. I clicked to the next slide, our current numbers. Our stock has tripled. Employee satisfaction is at record highs. Our new security platform is revolutionizing the industry. And now, Shanice added, we're about to announce the biggest initiative in company history. I nodded to Mom, who stood up. The Phoenix Foundation will be launching a scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in tech. Full ride, plus internships, funded entirely by company profits. But that's not all, I continued. We're also establishing an ethics board to oversee all major decisions, because power unchecked is power corrupted. Harold, the veteran board member, cleared his throat. Your father called me yesterday, from prison. The room tensed. I kept my voice steady. What did he want? To say he's proud of all of this, of you. Before I could respond, my assistant rushed in. Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. In the lobby stood Patricia's daughter, Sarah, clutching a laptop. You need to see this, she said, opening it. Someone's trying to hack our new platform. I smiled. I know, it's a test. Her eyes widened. What? Watch. I pulled up our security dashboard on the lobby screen. Lines of code flowed across it, showing the attack and our system's response. Every attempt they make reveals another weakness, which our AI patches in real time. That's brilliant, she breathed. That's what happens when you build something on truth instead of lies. I turned to find Shanice watching us. Ready to show her the rest? Back in the conference room, we unveiled the full scope of our plans. Not just scholarships and ethics boards, but a complete reimagining of what a tech company could be. Transparent, accountable, human. There's one more thing, I announced. I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations. Gasps filled the room. Not leaving, I clarified quickly. But it's time for new voices. Shanice will be taking over as CEO. I'll remain as board chair, focusing on strategy and mentorship. Like Patricia did for you, Mom said softly. Exactly. Because that's how we break the cycle. Not by hoarding power, but by sharing it. Not by fear, but by trust. Later, as the sun set over Boston, I found myself in the rooftop garden where this journey had really begun, where Shanice had first proposed building something that could challenge my father's empire. Quite a day, Yosef said, joining me. You okay? Better than okay. I showed him my phone, an email from the prison. My father had enrolled in a business ethics course, teaching it, not taking it. Sometimes people can surprise you. Speaking of surprises, Shanice called from the door. Your mother's foundation just received an anonymous donation, $10 million. Martina's restitution money, I realized. She finally paid it back. Full circle, Mom said, appearing with glasses of champagne. But this time, it's going to help people instead of hurt them. We stood there, watching the city lights flicker on, the same view that had once represented everything I'd lost. Now it showed everything we'd built instead. To Phoenix, Shanice raised her glass, not just rising from the ashes, but soaring beyond them. To family, Mom added, the ones we're born with and the ones we choose. To the future, Yosef said. I looked at these people who had become more than colleagues, more than friends. They were my true legacy. Not the money, not the revenge, not even the success. Just this, the power of truth, the strength of trust, and the endless possibility of beginning again. To beginning again, I said, raising my glass to meet theirs. And getting it right this time.
Juana, why do you always look so plain? Honestly, thinking that you're my daughter depresses me. And being 38 and still single, what a troublesome existence you are. Troublesome existence? Compared to you, Melissa takes after me. She's truly beautiful and charismatic. It's hard to believe you two were born to the same mother. Maybe you were switched at birth at the hospital, don't you think? But Dad always said I looked just like him. That's true. I should have been more careful when choosing a partner back then. No matter how much money someone makes, marrying a man with such a plain appearance leads to having a daughter as dull as you. Don't talk about Dad that way. Unlike you, Dad always treated Melissa and me equally. Well, your plain father and you were two of a kind close buddies, weren't you? But unfortunately, he's no longer here. Now there's no one left to defend you. I can hardly remember being praised by my mother growing up. I have an older sister, 2 years older than me, who is both beautiful and highly intelligent. To my mother, Melissa was her pride and joy, whereas plain and unremarkable me seemed to lack any lovable qualities in her eyes. I'm Juana Price, a 38-year-old single office worker. My sister graduated from a prestigious national university, joined a top-tier company, and married her older colleague at age 28. Her husband, Harrison Green, is a promising elite employee highly regarded in his field. Harrison Green, nice to meet you. Just like my sister, he's flawless, and the two are viewed as an ideal couple, envied by everyone around them. Because Harrison frequently travels for work, spending more than half the year away from home, we've barely had the chance to meet and haven't grown close. My sister gave birth to her first daughter at 33 and had a son at 37. After her maternity leave, she returned to work, balancing her job and childcare seamlessly. Beautiful and diligent, both at work and at home, my sister is someone I deeply admire. That's why, whenever my mother compares us, saying, "You'll never measure up to your sister," I have no choice but to accept it without protest. Still, being ranked by your own mother leaves an indelible scar on a child's heart. My father passed away 7 years ago due to illness. It was just after my sister had given birth to her first daughter. My sister said she was glad our father got to see his grandchild before he passed, as it brought him great joy. People often said I resembled my father as a child. Moreover, my father treated both my sister and me with equal love and care. Melissa was studious from an early age and always sat at her desk as soon as she came home. Studying is fun. When I learn new things, it feels like my mind is expanding. I remember her saying things like that often. On the other hand, I struggled with studying and couldn't seem to retain anything. The idea of my mind expanding made no sense to me. With more knowledge, it feels like the future is opening up. Thinking that way makes the future seem so bright. Though Melissa spoke passionately about it, I couldn't see such a shining future. I never found studying enjoyable, nor did I have the passion for it that she did. Despite this, Melissa always devoted herself to studying at home and excelled in sports outside. She consistently won track and field competitions and served as the anchor in relay races, crossing the finish line first. Watching her, I felt words like gifted in both academics and athletics and beauty with brains were made for her. There's a saying that heaven does not bestow two gifts, but observing Melissa, It felt like she had been blessed with not just two but everything. So I had resigned myself somewhere along the way, thinking it might be inevitable for my mother to adore my older sister. No matter how hard I tried, I could never measure up to her. My sister was someone I admired, but as people around us often compared us with remarks like, "Even though you're sisters," it gradually became awkward to be around her. Though our relationship wasn't hostile, we weren't especially close either. Her talent and achievements were so overwhelming that she seemed like someone from another dimension to me. As I grew older, I began to think that comparing us was pointless. Even so, my heart was repeatedly wounded by the blatant sarcasm my mother would throw my way. No matter how much you try to get used to criticism or comparisons, it's something you can never truly adapt to. "Mom, could you stop comparing me to Juana? We're different people." "You're right, my bad. But can you blame me? The difference is just so obvious. I can see why you would feel upset, Melissa." Sometimes, when my mother would make sarcastic remarks, my sister would step in to defend me. But even her words sounded to me like, "Stop comparing me to someone like her." When you have an exceptionally talented sister, no matter how much you try not to think about it, a sense of inferiority inevitably takes root in some corner of your heart. No matter where I went, people would say, "Your sister is so and so," constantly comparing us. It was only natural that this would happen. And my mother, as if enjoying these comparisons, would keep adding fuel to the fire. "Juana really takes after your father, unlike you, Melissa." When my mother laughed while saying this, I felt an inexplicable discomfort. Being told I resembled my father made me happy. I loved my father dearly. But the tone in my mother's words carried a hint of disdain toward my father, and that was something I couldn't stand. In such moments, my father always came to my defense. "Hey, enough already. Both of them are our precious daughters. Melissa has her strengths, and so does Juana." "Juana's strengths? I have no idea where those are, though." I said, "Stop it." Even though my father rarely raised his voice, these exchanges became a routine part of our household. After my father passed away, we decided to let go of the family home. The house was old, built by my father's grandfather, and was in disrepair. The windows wouldn't close properly, the second floor visibly slanted to the point where a ball would roll on its own. The floors creaked with every step, and it felt like it was only a matter of time before they gave way. Everyone agreed it was difficult to continue living there without major renovations. So we concluded it was better to sell the house and use the money to secure a new home. Though the house held many memories, my father had once jokingly said, "This house has reached its limit," so I believed he would have supported our decision. At the time, my sister and her husband were living in a rented apartment, but a plan emerged to use the proceeds from the house sale and their savings to build a two-family home for everyone to live in together. My sister offered me a choice, saying, "We can divide the money from the sale, and if you want to live alone, that's fine too." But my mother insisted strongly that we should build a two-family home. Under that pressure, both my sister's family and I ended up agreeing to her suggestion. Although I felt a desire to distance myself from my mother, I also felt uncertain about living alone for the first time. As I wavered, my brother-in-law reassured me, saying, "I travel a lot for work, so it would be a relief to have you around, Juana." My sister added, "I plan to continue working too, so having you here would really help." Unsure whether their words were sincere or just polite, I still felt somewhat happy to think they needed me. Thus, I decided to move into the new house and live with them. On the other hand, my mother blatantly said things like, "Honestly, the house would feel more spacious without Juana." Well, at best, she might be useful for babysitting. However, since my sister and her husband agreed to let me live with them, my mother didn't oppose the arrangement any further. Since my brother-in-law's parents had already passed away, no one objected to my sister's family living with us, so the plan moved forward smoothly. Now I live in the new house as a single woman. It seems my mother isn't too happy with this situation. How long do you plan to keep relying on your family home? She's asked me this question multiple times, but I managed to brush it off. My mother's sarcastic remarks are so routine that taking them seriously would be endless. Besides, my sister's children are absolutely adorable. My 7-year-old niece, Sarah, and 3-year-old nephew, Sammy, call me Aunt Juana and are very attached to me. When my sister works late, I sometimes pick them up from daycare. Seeing their excited faces as they run toward me always warms my heart. This year, Sarah started elementary school, and while I miss seeing her sweet little face light up like that, I feel comforted knowing Sammy is still young, and I can enjoy these moments with him for a while longer. So, you're 38 this year? When do you plan on getting married? I don't have any plans at the moment. Do you really think you can get married with that face? Honestly, it's hopeless. Marriage isn't everything, and I'm holding down a steady job. Don't act so high and mighty just because you work at some third-rate company. I'm not acting high and mighty. I can't stand seeing someone as plain-looking as you hanging around. Honestly, I wish you'd just disappear. Do you really have to say all that? Sarah and Sammy are so adorable, taking after Melissa. But with you here, I worry your looks might somehow rub off on them. Even though my mother doesn't spend much time with her grandchildren, she brings them up just to criticize me. Honestly, I sometimes wonder if continuing to live with my sister's family at 38 is the right thing to do. Maybe I should start living on my own. While I was considering this, my sister told me she was expecting her 3rd child. Both my sister and brother-in-law, as well as the kids, were overjoyed. A 3rd one, huh? Though my brother-in-law, like my sister, doesn't show his emotions much, he looked genuinely happy about the news. I felt happy for them too, but my mother's snide remarks intensified as a result. You're really just aging without contributing anything, aren't you? You're just wasting time getting older. I'm not exactly causing you any trouble, am I? You can't get married or have kids. Meanwhile, Melissa is already on her 3rd child. People like you, who just grow older without producing anything, are nothing but a nuisance. Hurry up and leave. What? Sigh. Juana, why are you so plain looking? Honestly, thinking of you as my daughter depresses me. And to still be single at 38, it's truly troubling. Troubling. What does that even mean? In contrast, Melissa is so beautiful and radiant, just like me. It's hard to believe you both came from the same mother. Maybe you were switched at birth in the hospital or something. But Dad always said I look like him. That's true. I should have been more careful when choosing a partner back then. No matter how much money he made, marrying a man who looks like that is why I ended up with such a plain daughter. Don't talk about Dad like that. Unlike you, Dad treated Melissa and me equally. Well, you and your ugly father were always close, weren't you? But unfortunately, he's gone now, and there's no one left to defend you. I couldn't believe how my mother spoke so gleefully about my father's death. And as if to twist the knife further, she continued, "You don't understand unless it's spelled out, do you? Not only are you ugly, but you're also dumb and inconsiderate. You don't have to say it like that. If I don't say it, you won't get it. Even Melissa always says having someone like you in the house is a nuisance. Is that true? It's the truth. The fact that you don't even realize it just proves how hopeless you are." While I didn't fully believe my mother's words, I couldn't help but wonder in the back of my mind. If my sister really felt that way, it would deeply hurt me. Although I wasn't entirely free of insecurities around my sister, I thought we had managed to maintain a comfortable distance and a good relationship. I considered asking her about it, but something held me back. Perhaps it would be better to leave quietly rather than confirm it outright. After all, this wasn't really my home anymore. It felt more like my sister and her husband's house. It was only natural for both my mother and my sister to see my prolonged stay here as inconvenient. That day, I finally resolved to leave the house. But when I returned from work, my belongings were carelessly piled by the front door. "What's going on here?" Since you wouldn't leave, I decided to put your stuff outside. That's awful. You didn't have to do this. Well, you clearly don't get it when I say it, so I had no choice. Looking at my scattered clothes, I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I felt pathetic and ashamed, picking up my things while wondering what I was doing with my life. At that moment, my sister arrived home with my nephew and niece. She must have picked them up from daycare and after-school care on her way back from work. Seeing me gathering my clothes, my sister looked at me coldly. What is this situation? The kids also stared at me, puzzled. My sister's gaze felt like it pierced through me, making me feel even more wretched. See, isn't it better without Juana around? She's nothing but a burden. A burden. She's already old enough, yet she can't get married, can't have kids, and works at a third-rate company. She's completely worthless. Just having her here is a waste of time and money. Hearing my mother's words, my sister turned her eyes toward me. Suddenly, my niece came over and started helping me pick up my clothes. Aunt Juana, what are you doing, Sarah? You don't need to do that. Stop it. Pretty girls don't do things like that. Leave the garbage picking to the ugly ones. Despite the presence of my niece and nephew, I was on the verge of tears. Are you okay? I see. So that's how it is. My sister watched the scene unfold with a stern expression. Her silence made me wonder if she, too, saw me in this light. The thought made me feel even more miserable. I bit my lip in regret, thinking I should have left the house much earlier. Melissa, you feel the same way, don't you? I'm not needed in this family, am I? If people without productivity aren't needed, then I feel the same way, my sister said. Hearing her words, my mother reacted with delight. I struggled to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill. I felt that crying now would only make me feel even more pathetic. Exactly. Anyone wasting money should leave. Someone wasting money, huh? Then why don't you leave, Mom? What? Even my mother was shocked, and for a moment I couldn't understand what my sister had said. I thought I must have misheard her and found myself staring at my sister's face. She met my eyes and smiled warmly. It was clear she had meant exactly what she said. My mother looked bewildered, seemingly even more confused by my sister's words than I was. Mom, didn't you hear me? Wait a minute. What are you saying? It's supposed to be Juana who leaves. My sister calmly set Sammy down from her arms. Then she looked at Sarah and asked her to take Sammy to their room. Sarah nodded with a sweet smile. Come on, Sammy, let's go. She cheerfully took his hand and led him into the house. After watching them leave, my sister spoke. You said it yourself, Mom. People without productivity should leave. That describes you, doesn't it? Are you joking? I'm your mother. I gave birth to you. And what are you doing now? Wasting money, just eating and sleeping. Where's the productivity in that? My sister's words left my mother wide-eyed with shock. She looked almost cartoonish, her eyes bulging as if they might pop out. You don't help take care of the kids, you don't assist with picking them up from daycare, and you don't do any housework. All of that has been done by Juana. Without her, I would have been completely lost. Sis, that's just because she's a freeloader, isn't it? Mom, you're a freeloader too. Juana pays her share of living expenses every month, but you use all your pension on yourself and don't contribute to utilities or groceries. I'm your parent. It's the children's responsibility to take care of their parents. And besides, the money to build this house came from selling your father's house. That gives me the right to live here. It's useless to argue that. When we sold the family home, you claimed half as your inheritance. But this house was built entirely with the rest of the inheritance and my savings. Juana's rightful share was also used for this house, which gives her the right to live here. You, Mom, who didn't put in a single cent, don't have that right. What? Indeed, when the family home was sold, there had been a discussion about dividing the inheritance. But I had assumed the money was used to build the new house. At the time, my sister had offered to give me my share, but I chose not to take it, thinking it was better used for the house. It seemed natural to me, and I had assumed my mother thought the same. After all, she had been so adamant about building a two-family home. That's right. Dad's inheritance was divided, with half going to Mom and the rest split between Juana and me. So, half of it is mine. But Mom, this house was built with the remaining inheritance and our savings. That includes the share Juana should have received. So Juana has every right to live here. You, who didn't contribute a single dollar, don't. What? Mom, you claimed the entire inheritance as your share and didn't contribute to building this house. That means you have no right to live here. So, shouldn't it be you who leaves? It seemed my sister's words finally sank in, as my mother's face gradually turned pale. She never imagined my sister would say something like this. My mother had always cherished my sister, firmly believing she would always take her side no matter what. To be honest, I was just as surprised as my mother to hear my sister speak this way. But upon reflection, it felt very much like something my sister would do. Since childhood, she had always approached things objectively, without letting emotions cloud her judgment. Her expressions rarely betrayed her feelings, making her emotions difficult to read, but she always made logical decisions. I remember hearing about how, as a middle schooler, she witnessed bullying and used her reasoning skills to thoroughly defeat the bully in an argument. People around her sometimes described her as cold and calculating. Even so, I had always been proud of her. Seeing her unchanged after all these years, I felt a deep sense of admiration. What? Are you planning to kick your own mother out? Have you forgotten everything I've done for you? Everything you've done? All you ever did was parade me around to show off. I was nothing more than a tool for your self-satisfaction. Hearing my sister's words, I realized she, too, had been harboring deep feelings about our mother. I used to envy how my sister always went out with our mother, but she had never seemed to enjoy herself. It wasn't that our mother adored her to our mother, my sister was simply a trophy to flaunt. Even so, I've kept quiet because you're our mother. But Juana is also my beloved sister, and she's family. I believe family members should support each other. Hearing my sister's words warmed my heart, and I felt tears welling up. Knowing my sister thought of me this way filled me with joy. She truly was someone I could be proud of. Besides, Sarah is in elementary school now and understands more than you think. Having someone like you around would only have a negative impact on her, so you need to leave. What? Are you serious? Yes, I've reached my limit. It's not good for me or the baby to keep enduring this. Where am I supposed to go? My sister cast a single glance at my mother and walked past her without a word. My mother sank to the floor. As I quietly tried to pass her, she suddenly grabbed my leg. Even you're abandoning me? Who do you think raised you to this point? You're not. What? You're not my parent. My only parent was Dad. With that, I walked into the house. My mother stared at our backs in stunned silence. Later, my mother tried to speak to my sister in a gentler tone, but my sister completely ignored her, acting as though she didn't even exist. Eventually, my sister told the kids, "Grandma is leaving." Yay. That's great. What? Well, Grandma was always mean to Aunt Juana. I didn't like her. Sarah said this cheerfully, laughing. Hearing her words, my mother seemed even more frozen in place. Children are incredibly perceptive, I thought once again. Afterward, my mother began living alone in a small, run-down apartment behind the train station. My sister quickly found an apartment and moved my mother's belongings out in no time. I was impressed by her swift and decisive actions. However, my sister is the one paying for the rent of that apartment. You would think my mother would at least be grateful for that, but she doesn't seem to feel any gratitude at all. Apparently, over the past 7 years, my mother had spent all the money from the sale of the house. I had felt something was off about her lavish lifestyle. wondering if my sister was giving her some financial support. But that wasn't the case. She probably thought she could spend her savings freely because my sister was covering her living expenses. She had racked up considerable credit card debt, so her monthly payments were quite significant. Most of her pension went toward paying off those debts, leaving her in a tough financial spot. She had asked my sister multiple times to let her move back, but my sister refused. She even called me asking to borrow money, but I, of course, declined. Since then, I stopped communicating with her. One day, I spotted my mother working part-time at a supermarket. When she noticed me, she approached and demanded money. Seeing her still energetic reassured me in a strange way. It seemed she wasn't well liked at her part-time job due to her bossy attitude, and she lived a quiet life in her apartment with no friends visiting her. That was likely the last time I would see her. 2 years later, I got married and moved out. Afterward, my sister and her husband gave me the full amount of money from the sale of our father's house. My sister explained that they had saved it so they could return my share when I got married. Initially, I said I didn't need it since I had relied on their home for so long. But my sister insisted, saying that because I had always contributed to household expenses, I deserved to have the money back. Once again, I felt so grateful to have such an amazing sister. A year later, I gave birth to twin daughters. I remained close with my sister and her family. Her third child was a boy. Her 3 kids adored my twins as if they were their own little sisters. I truly hope we can continue to maintain this loving and close relationship for many years to come. Under the icy December night sky, I stared at the sight of my beloved SUV crashing into a telephone pole. Snow began to cover the car's body, and the chrome decorations glistened coldly like ice. This scene seemed to foreshadow the impending collapse of our family. However, to tell this story, I must start from much earlier, for the distortions within our family began long ago. My name is Kristen Carlson. This story might seem to revolve around a dispute over a car on the surface. In reality, however, it is a record of the long-standing distortions in my family erupting all at once. The car was merely a symbol. The events surrounding it mercilessly brought to light the truths we did not want to see. Within what appeared to be a peaceful family, everyone's grievances, secrets, and scars overflowed from that night onward. Looking back, that night was a turning point for our family. In my family, there was an unspoken but recognized hierarchy, and at its pinnacle stood my brother, Jonathan. From birth, Jonathan received all our parents' affection. His arrival was a miracle for my parents, who had struggled with infertility. However, when I was born unexpectedly a year later, the joy of my parents was not as profound as it had been, as my grandmother later confided to me. "Your mother wanted a boy," she said. "After Jonathan was born, her wish was fulfilled. You were an unexpected gift." This unexpected gift continued to be treated as an extra. Everything Jonathan wanted was given to him, his failures were forgiven, and even his violent actions were dismissed with a laugh, because boys will be boys. Issues related to Jonathan in our family were always swept under the rug for special reasons, but if I did the same, I was immediately scolded. One of my earliest memories is of a doll I received on my 5th birthday. I vividly remember the day Jonathan broke the doll that I had cherished and displayed. "Your brother was just curious," my mother said, dismissing my tears. "It's your fault for not taking care of your things." Such unreasonable situations were my daily reality. My possessions were also Jonathan's. My books, my toys, my time, all were taken away under the pretext of, for my brother's sake. Yet, as a child, I wanted to believe that my family loved me. Otherwise, the daily reality was simply too sad. Even at school, I could not escape Jonathan's influence. He was athletic and popular, while I was a quiet student who often spent time in the library. I felt as if I had no place anywhere, but the quiet library was my sanctuary. However, I always maintained top grades. Perhaps that was a desperate attempt to be recognized. I hoped that by being special in some way, my family would finally see me. "Kristen, why can't you be like your brother?" my father often said. "Jonathan is proactive. Everyone likes him. But you." His words trailed off, but the meaning was clear. No matter how hard I tried, Jonathan's shadow never faded. Our parents treated such situations as if they were the norm. "Because he's your brother. Because we're family." These words constantly suppressed my feelings. It was considered the norm in our family, and nobody questioned it. No matter how much I internally resisted, the atmosphere that did not allow me to raise my voice was ever present. And gradually, I realized that in this family I was just existing. On my 18th birthday, I left home. Carrying only a small bag, I left the house before dawn, and strangely, I felt a sense of relief. When I gently closed the door of the house, I felt as if I had been released from the overwhelming pressure that had crushed me. I didn't look back, only walked forward. From somewhere in the distance, the sound of birds chirping could be heard, and as the faint light began to illuminate the sky, a realization quietly surged within me that I was starting a new life. The one who welcomed me was my paternal uncle, Douglas. I had vague memories of meeting him when I was young, but since then, there had been little interaction. Nonetheless, as a former police officer, he had long been concerned about my family's situation. This goes back to the time when my family visited Uncle Douglas's house when I was a child. By chance, Uncle Douglas overheard my parents praising Jonathan while dismissing me. "Kristen is a bit too introverted, isn't she? Can't she be more outgoing like Jonathan?" my father said, to which my mother laughed and replied, "Well, she's a girl, so maybe that can't be helped." Although Uncle Douglas didn't pursue the matter deeply at the time, he occasionally checked on me afterward. Sometimes he would call and ask, "Is Kristen all right?" But my parents would lightly dismiss it, saying, "Oh, she's all fine." His concern turned into conviction when I appeared on the list of top students published by my middle school. Uncle Douglas happened to see it and wanted to praise my efforts, but he was faced with my parents' cold response when he contacted them. "Kristen's grades are good, but more importantly, Jonathan is doing well in his new sports team," they said, changing the subject. At that moment, Uncle Douglas realized how I was being treated within the family. Ever since then, Uncle Douglas had secretly resolved to always extend a helping hand whenever I reached out for help. When I reached out to him at the age of 18, he welcomed me without hesitation. His home was filled with a calm atmosphere I had never experienced before. The walls were adorned with photographs he had taken during his active days, and the bookshelves were lined with police-related books and magazines about his hobby, fishing. Everything seemed to reflect his personality, and each detail felt fresh to me. "Here you can be yourself," Uncle Douglas told me, providing me with a small room. Though modest, the room was furnished with warm wooden furniture and soft curtains, creating a comforting space. That night I cried tears of joy for having my own space for the first time. I buried my head in the pillow, unable to contain the emotions I had been holding back. Uncle Douglas gave me his SUV, which he had used during his time as a police officer. It wasn't in perfect condition, but the engine was robust, and the interior was well maintained. "I have a special attachment to this car," he said softly, caressing the hood. "Kristen, I believe you will take good care of it." The car became more than just a means of transportation for me. It symbolized freedom and independence, a testament to my new life. Every time I drove, I felt like I was stepping into a broader world. The feel of the steering wheel, the vibrations from pressing the accelerator, all of it reminded me that I was alive. Polishing the car before going to work became my daily ritual, almost like meditation. As I wiped the body with a cloth, I felt my mind gradually aligning itself. The sound of the engine starting seemed like a heartbeat filled with hope. I vividly remember the coldness of the wind and the sense of freedom when I first drove the car through the city. Life with Uncle Douglas gradually healed my spirit. During dinner times, we would laugh over stories from his days as a police officer and his fishing trips. Those peaceful moments became incredibly precious to me. I wasn't used to being loved, but Uncle Douglas was always on my side, respecting my existence. For the first time, I began to understand what it meant to be myself. The days spent in his home were shaping a new form of family for me. Family is determined by bonds, not blood. Uncle Douglas's words deeply resonated with me. Meanwhile, Jonathan's life was filled with turmoil. In high school, he was celebrated as a star athlete, but things did not go well for him after entering college. Initially, he received a scholarship and led a glamorous life as a member of the American football team, but his lack of focus on practice and indulgence in flashy play led to poor grades. Eventually, he was forced to drop out after 2 years. He drifted through various jobs afterward, none lasting long due to conflicts with supervisors or criticisms of his lack of responsibility. Jonathan always boasted, "I can do bigger things," but reality did not accept him. His irresponsibility manifested in his personal life too, causing problems with speeding and drunk driving, and leading to the destruction of 3 cars. The worst incident was when he completely wrecked the last car by crashing it into a telephone pole. After that, the insurance company refused to renew his contract, and he could no longer own a car. However, his obsession with cars remained. This fixation eventually led his gaze to my cherished SUV. On Christmas night, I was spending time with my family at my parents' house for the first time in a long while. The reason I visited my estranged family was a letter from my mother. As the year-end approached, she had sent a brief letter saying, "It would be nice if we could spend time together as a family." The content was simple, but I couldn't gauge the emotion behind it, and decided to attend after some hesitation. Perhaps I hadn't yet mustered the courage to completely cut ties with my family. Snow quietly continued to fall outside the window, enveloping the surroundings in a white, silvery world. The living room was warm with the fireplace burning, and the table was set with roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and green bean casserole, creating the appearance of a perfect family gathering. My mother carried a cake from the kitchen, and my father poured wine, both in high spirits, but I sat there feeling uneasy. Jonathan seemed to act as if nothing was wrong, but every time his gaze turned toward me, a sense of wariness spread through my heart. I had noticed his interest in the SUV long before. A few weeks before Christmas, we had accidentally reunited. One holiday, as I was having lunch at a cafe near Uncle Douglas's house, Jonathan suddenly appeared. It seemed that the apartment he was living in at the time was near Uncle Douglas's house, and he had spotted me by chance. "Kristen, you live around here." He sat down with a surprised look on his face. At first, I was cautious, but Jonathan started chatting in his usual lighthearted manner, asking about my life. It was then that I noticed his gaze shifting towards my SUV parked in the lot. "Hey, Kristen, is that car yours?" he pointed out, his eyes lighting up. "It was a gift from Uncle Douglas," I replied, and Jonathan nodded in admiration. "It's a nice car. It has a strong feel that I love. I'd like one like this someday, but it's just not possible right now," Jonathan said, his gaze hinting at something beyond mere curiosity. Even during our casual conversation, it became evident that he was fixated on it. This brief reunion made me aware of Jonathan's interest in my SUV. Perhaps that's why, on Christmas night, I had a lingering anxiety that he might target it. The incident occurred towards the end of the night. After the family had retired to their rooms, I was the only one left in the living room. As I stared into the fireplace, lost in thought, I suddenly realized that my car keys were missing. They were nowhere to be found in my bag. A sense of unease quickly turned into a foreboding feeling. I rushed to the window and saw that the space where the SUV had been parked was now empty. I felt the blood drain from my face. I hurriedly grabbed my phone and opened the tracking application Uncle Douglas had installed. The screen flashed with the indication that the car was moving several miles away. Jonathan had taken my car keys without me noticing and stolen my cherished SUV. I later learned that he needed the car to go to a party with friends. Why he would do such a thing, why he wouldn't even borrow a car from someone else but instead use mine without permission, swirled through my mind. But before I could seek answers to these questions, the urge to retrieve the car overcame me. And as I had feared, under the influence of alcohol, Jonathan mishandled the car and crashed on the icy road. I took a taxi to the scene, where I found the SUV smashed against a telephone pole and Jonathan being led away by the police, still drunk. Seeing that sight tightened a knot in my chest. The car, handed down from Uncle Douglas, was precious to me. More importantly, it was a symbol of my freedom, and to see it destroyed in such a way was unbearable. However, what shocked me even more was the reaction of my parents. They had arrived at the scene before me and were attempting to lie to the police officers, saying, "The car belongs to our daughter. She was driving. Our son was just caught up in it." The motive was clear. They were willing to sacrifice me to protect their son. My daughter Kristen was driving, my mother explained shakily to the officer. She got a bit panicked. We came to help her. At that moment, I felt as if my blood had turned to ice. The family distortion I had faintly sensed up until now was starkly evident. My parents had never really intended to protect me. Any slight hope I had for my family evaporated in that instant. Feeling a surge of anger building inside, I decided to call Uncle Douglas. He answered immediately, and upon hearing my situation, he said he would come right away. Knowing Uncle Douglas had connections with the police, I hoped that his arrival would help stabilize the situation. After a while, Uncle Douglas arrived at the scene. As a former police officer, he assessed the situation calmly and quickly spoke to the officers. One of the officers at the scene happened to be a former colleague of his. "I'm aware of what happened here. Jonathan was driving a stolen car," he began his testimony. Uncle Douglas's statement, surveillance footage from the scene, and the tracking records of my car all matched, clearly proving that Jonathan had stolen the car. Subsequently, the police conducted a more detailed investigation, and Jonathan was arrested for driving without a license and under the influence. His actions resulted in a suspension of his license for over a year, a fine of several $1,000s, and a criminal record. Then, the discussion about the car repair costs began in a more contentious atmosphere than anticipated. Under the fluorescent lights of the body shop, my father's face looked more severe than usual. Jonathan offered to pay all the repair costs. It must have been a significant decision for him. However, my parents objected to his decision. "There's no need for that," my mother said with a trembling voice. "We're family, we should share the burden." That statement cut through something inside me. Emotions I had suppressed for years overflowed like a dam bursting. "Enough is enough," I shouted. "Why do you always protect him?" I had no choice but to leave home, to go to Uncle Douglas's house, all because of you guys. You're covering for him even after he stole my car, and you even tried to lie to the police, and now, when he's finally trying to take responsibility, you're still interfering. What's the family about this? The shop fell silent. At that moment, a customer waiting for repairs muttered under his breath, "Oh my goodness." Typical parents who hinder their child's growth. That comment snapped my father's restraint. He attacked the stranger, later identified as Michael Fisher, with unchecked aggression. My father's fists mercilessly struck Michael's face, slamming him against the wall. I was frozen with fear. The violent tendencies my father had shown at home were now exposed to the outside world. As the staff called the police, my father, in a panic, left my mother behind and fled. After being detained for several weeks, he was released. During his detention, he was ordered to undergo a mandatory anger management program. The program included cognitive behavioral therapy and group therapy, and it definitely changed my father's condition. Meanwhile, Jonathan also paid a heavy price. He faced a criminal record, paid hefty fines, and received a suspension of his driver's license for over a year. This series of experiences seemed to have a significant impact on him. He became like a different person, actively trying to mend our relationship. He reached out almost weekly, deeply reflecting on his past actions and repeatedly apologizing. However, his relationship with our father did not improve. Instead, the distance between them only grew. In particular, their shared criminal records seemed to push them further apart. The most shocking change was my mother's transformation. After the arrests of my brother and father, she became like a different person. Her attitude towards me became cold, and her anger intensified. She started to blame everything on me, and her words were piercing. If you had just lent him the car from the beginning, none of this would have happened. Kristen, you destroyed our family. Are you satisfied with ruining our reputation? Each of these accusations deeply wounded me. Finally, I decided to completely cut off my relationship with her. I no longer wanted to accept her hurtful words. My feelings for my mother cooled, and I crossed a line that could never be undone. My grandparents, who had heard the whole story from Uncle Douglas, reacted in a way no one expected. They made the severe decision to disinherit my parents. Those who should protect the family but instead break it do not deserve our trust or our estate, my grandfather stated, deeply hurting my parents' hearts. This decision fundamentally changed my parents' lives. Without the inheritance from my grandparents, my parents lost the financial comfort they had taken for granted. They had relied on the anticipated wealth and assets to sustain their lavish lifestyle. However, with that foundation gone, their lives were transformed. They were forced to give up their luxuries and adapt to a more modest lifestyle. Thus, my parents began to harshly feel the consequences of their past actions. Later, when my grandparents approached me about the inheritance, I took my time to consider it. Since money was one of the factors that broke my family, I want to thoroughly assess how I live my future. Jonathan and I now meet once a month, and knowing that he is sincerely working on his rehabilitation, I can see his growth. He participates in an alcohol dependency treatment program and has found stable employment. Seeing him commuting by bicycle is unimaginable from his once arrogant demeanor. I'm ashamed of my past self, he admits, accepting his mistakes and trying to move forward. Our relationship is slowly rebuilding at a gentle pace. Meanwhile, my father has also started to confront his emotions. He actively participates in anger management sessions, delving into the roots of his violent tendencies, gradually reflecting on his past actions, and showing signs of remorse. However, my relationship with my mother remains frozen. Sometimes I feel a desire to mend our relationship, but each time her words echo in my mind, and I choose to keep my distance. The scars from the past are not easily healed. Facing financial difficulties, my parents have had to significantly revise their previous lifestyle. My mother started a part-time job, and my father now takes extra shifts on weekends to supplement their income. It's painful to see them struggle, but at the same time, this experience seems to be teaching them humility. While keeping my distance, I continue to observe their changes. My mother has sent me emails apologizing, but I have not yet replied, nor am I in a hurry to do so. My father completed his anger management program and now participates in community volunteer activities on weekends. This was recommended by his counselor as a way to control his anger. His help in coaching sports for young people has completely erased his previously intimidating demeanor. His expression now shows a certain calmness and sense of responsibility, making him seem like a different person from before. The settlement with Mr. Fisher, who was a victim of my father's violence, has also been resolved. My parents continue to pay compensation, which has become a significant financial burden, but it seems to be a necessary atonement. While their efforts to fulfill their past responsibilities are commendable, regaining trust is not something that can happen immediately. The bonds of family can sometimes be a strong force that unites us, but can also be chains that bind us. However, I have learned that having the courage to break those chains can pave the way for a new future. Uncle Douglas taught me that people can change, but the process of changing is not always comfortable. It can be painful and often requires significant sacrifices. Knowing this, I want to live my life not to meet someone else's expectations, but for myself. I don't know what the landscape will look like this time next year. Nevertheless, as I gaze at the SUV enveloped in snow, I quietly resolve not to be bound by the past and to move forward at my own pace. From the office of the company left to me by my father, I gaze down upon the city at dusk. Through the windows of the high-rise buildings, the orange-painted sky and the bustling crowd below appear minuscule. My name is Jessica Hansen. I'm 28 years old. My father, Richard Hansen, built this company from scratch, but a year ago, he suddenly passed away. Since then, my stepmother Dorothy and stepsister Lauren have cast dark shadows over my life. After earning my master's degree in business administration from Stanford University, I joined my father's company, rising to the top of the marketing department with my inherent creativity and execution skills. I continued my father's legacy, contributing to the company's development. However, rumors have reached me that Dorothy and Lauren are influencing the board to threaten my position. The atmosphere within the company has gradually begun to change. Executives who were once supportive are now keeping their distance. My father Richard married Dorothy when I was 25. They met at a charity party. Dorothy, then 45 years old, captured 57-year-old Richard's heart with her beauty and intelligence. Having lost his wife 15 years earlier and raised me, his only daughter, Richard may have seen a chance for a second life in Dorothy's elegance and thoughtfulness. Jessica, we are going to have a new family member, my father announced, just 3 months after meeting Dorothy. At that moment, I felt uncomfortable. The decision felt way too hasty. However, seeing my father happy for the first time in a long while, I could only nod in agreement. Dorothy had a daughter, Lauren, a year younger than me. Initially, Lauren was reserved and even friendly. "Can I call you sister?" she asked, and I thought to open my heart to her. The first few months after the marriage were peaceful. Dorothy played the perfect wife, making Richard happy. Family dinners were frequent, and on the surface it seemed like an ideal family. However, changes gradually began to appear. First, Dorothy started showing interest in managing the company. "I want to lessen your burden," she would say, gradually attending important meetings. Richard, moved by his wife's dedication, began to heed her opinions. At the same time, Dorothy's behavior at home started to shift. Her words towards me began to contain subtle barbs, and she overtly favored Lauren. "Jessica, you're old enough to have your own home, aren't you? It seems Lauren understands your father's company better than you do," she would casually remark. Richard's health began to deteriorate 2 years after their marriage. He collapsed from a sudden heart attack and was forced to spend a week in the hospital. After that, he continued to work while repeatedly being hospitalized. Every time my father was hospitalized, Dorothy showed devoted care. However, I noticed documents requiring my father's signature being brought into his hospital room. And then, on a peaceful spring day a few months later, my father passed away. That morning, I had received a call from him. "I have some time this evening?" His voice sounded tired. "Would you like to talk? Just the two of us." "Of course, Dad. Shall we meet at our usual restaurant at 6 in the evening?" "Yes, let's do that." However, that promise was never fulfilled. At 3 p.m., during a board meeting, Richard suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. When the arrival of the ambulance was announced, I was running down from the conference room on the upper floor. By the time I arrived at the hospital, it was too late. The doctor explained that it was a severe myocardial infarction. He never regained consciousness. I sat alone in my father's hospital room, holding his cold hand, reminiscing about our conversation that morning. What was he going to talk about? A week after my father's funeral, Dorothy, Lauren, and I gathered at the office of Joseph Anderson, my father's lawyer, for the inheritance proceedings. In the reception room, Dorothy, Lauren, and I sat down. Lawyer Anderson looked perplexed as he reviewed the documents. "This is odd," he said, frowning. Mr. Richard Hansen had mentioned that he had drafted a will. A will. Dorothy exclaimed in surprise. "I wasn't aware of it." Lawyer Anderson nodded gravely. "Yes. Actually, 2 months ago, when I met with Mr. Richard Hansen, he mentioned finalizing his will, especially concerning the succession of the company. But," he quietly said, "we haven't found the will in his study safe nor the company's safe. We've searched everywhere we could," Dorothy added, giving the impression of being a bit too hasty. "That's strange," Lawyer Anderson murmured, tilting his head. Mr. Richard Hansen was meticulous about his documents. He always kept a record of where important documents were stored. "My father was quite ill towards the end," I said. "Perhaps he didn't manage to prepare everything in time." "You are probably right," Dorothy continued hastily. "Yes, that might be it. Unfortunately, it looks like we'll have to proceed with the legal inheritance process." However, Lawyer Anderson's expression was not clear. Actually, he chose his words carefully. Mr. Richard Hansen had discussed the will in quite specific terms, especially. Just then, Dorothy stood up abruptly. "Excuse me, Mr. Anderson, but it's clear there is no will, right? Discussing it further when it doesn't exist." Her strong tone made Lawyer Anderson falter for a moment. "Yes, well, that's true," he conceded. I silently watched the exchange between them. There was a sense of urgency in Dorothy's demeanor. Suddenly, I recalled the unusual events on the day of my father's death. At the funeral, she had gone to my father's study alone. After about an hour, she returned as if nothing had happened. I was too engulfed in grief at the time to notice. But now, the strange behavior of that moment nagged at me. What had she been doing in my father's study? In the end, the inheritance proceedings moved forward without the will. However, my father's last words still haunted me. "I want to talk, just the two of us. I have something important to tell you." What was he going to say that day? Why had the will disappeared? This was no coincidence. My intuition was screaming it. A few days later, a general assembly was held at the company. Many employees reminisced about Richard Hansen's contributions. Yet, a dark shadow had already crept in. In her speech, Dorothy declared, "I will continue my husband's legacy and protect the company." The words struck a discordant note with me. The words my father wanted to convey at the end, the will that should have remained, had all been prepared for this moment. Soon after, rapid changes began within the company. Dorothy's influence in the boardroom increased, and she accelerated efforts to place her daughter Lauren in key positions. It was only a year after my father's death, and as time passed, I was unable to gather any information about her suspicious actions. One Wednesday afternoon, while preparing for an important board meeting, I overheard an unexpected conversation in the women's restroom. Just after I had entered a stall, Dorothy and Lauren came in. "Getting rid of Jessica's position is so easy. The board does whatever we say." Dorothy's voice carried an unfathomable chill. "But her marketing department is performing well, especially the Pendleton account, which accounts for 30% of the company's revenue." Lauren expressed concern. A hint of a guilty conscience could be heard in her voice. Then Dorothy's voice dropped suddenly. I instinctively pressed my ear against the wall to catch her words. "It doesn't matter. I've hidden the will, and I've already disposed of everything in Richard's study safe. Jessica has no evidence. The company is ours now. But that's..." "She. Be quiet," Dorothy snapped sharply. "Richard was foolish to leave such a will. But don't worry. I have a plan. We'll finalize the plan to remove Jessica at next week's board meeting." After they left, I was trembling. The business and legacy my father had desperately protected were in peril. My reflection in the restroom mirror was pale and bloodless. That night, I decided to consult with Nathan Fisher, a trusted colleague from my father's era and my mentor in the marketing department. We dined together at a high-end restaurant, where I detailed the conversation I had overheard. If the will is indeed hidden, that's a serious legal violation. Nathan said seriously. I knew your position was precarious. He took a sip of wine before continuing. Actually, there's also information that Dorothy has been quietly buying up company shares. Lately, she's been in frequent contact with the brokerage firm. That means... Yes, Jessica. Dorothy is plotting something. She's planning to oust you and install her daughter Lauren. She has used similar tactics in the past to take over her previous husband's company. His words brought back memories of my father. After his first hospital discharge, I sensed he was troubled by something. One rare night, just the two of us had dinner together. Jessica, I may have made a mistake, Richard had said quietly. Before I could delve deeper into the true intentions behind his words, Dorothy returned home earlier than expected, cutting our conversation short. That became the last genuine conversation I had with my father. Looking back, I should have probed deeper into his true feelings at that time. By the time he decided to speak to me again, it was already too late. My intuition was right, I said quietly. However, Nathan added, Dorothy's plan has a fatal flaw. She underestimates the law. If we exploit that, I resolved to fight. I won't let them take what my father built, I declared, with a sense of strength and pride inherited from my father. That night, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was Sandra Thompson, my father's former secretary. She had supported my father for over 30 years. Her expression mixed relief from years of pressure with new fears. After my father's death, Sandra had suddenly taken a leave of absence, citing health reasons, but the truth was different. Actually, I was threatened by Mrs. Dorothy Hanson, Sandra confessed, sitting down heavily at the desk. Right after Mr. Hanson passed away, she came to my home. That day, Dorothy had brought information about a job offer for Sandra's son, who had been struggling to find employment. You care about your son's future, don't you? Dorothy had whispered sweetly, holding an appointment letter from a major company in her hand. However, there is a condition. As Richard's secretary, you know a lot of confidential information. From now on, I need you to keep quiet about such matters. But that wasn't all. Sandra continued. I received monitoring calls almost weekly, and suspicious cars lingered around my house. I had to remain silent, fearing something might happen to my son. But I can't stay silent anymore, Sandra stated with determination. Mr. Richard Hanson trusted me with important information. It's time to honor that trust. Miss, I have something you need to see, she said, presenting an old diary. It belonged to my father. The leather-bound diary was worn at the corners. It contained entries about my father's anxieties after marrying Dorothy. I blame myself for not seeing her true nature. I should have investigated her past marriages and business reputation. I must protect Jessica. She is the only person who understands and can carry on my ideals. The words in the notes, especially those written during his hospital stay, struck a chord. I may not have long left. I couldn't stop Dorothy. Jessica, if this diary ever reaches you, please forgive my weakness. Until the end, your father was concerned about you, miss. He entrusted me to pass this to you if something happened to him. Yet, I was threatened by Mrs. Dorothy Hanson not to hand over anything from Mr. Richard Hanson. I was too scared. I'm sorry for the delay, Sandra said, tears shimmering in her eyes. I too should have noticed Mrs. Dorothy Hanson's ambitions earlier. That night, I read through my father's diary repeatedly. It was filled with his emotions. Joy, anguish, and regret. All vividly recorded. Particularly poignant were the words written on my birthday. Today, Jessica turns 5. Just seeing her smile makes all my fatigue vanish. For her, I must live honestly and earnestly. Wiping away tears, I renewed my resolve. This was not merely a struggle for control of a company. This was a fight to protect my father's ideals and his way of living. 3 nights later, With the help of Nathan and Sandra, I stepped into my father's study. That night, Dorothy and Lauren were at a charity party, not expected to return until late. The study, largely untouched since my father's death, was illuminated by moonlight. Jessica. Nathan paused in front of a bookshelf. Richard was meticulous. There must be some record. We began searching. Sandra at the desk drawers, Nathan at the bookshelves, and I near the safe. My father was known to regularly organize the contents of the safe. There had to be a record somewhere. "This is it," Nathan exclaimed, pulling out an old file. It was a supply management notebook my father had used for years. Flipping through, we found a detailed list of the safe's contents. The latest entry was just before my father first fell ill. Important documents including the will, stock certificates, company founding documents. My hands trembled. Indeed, the will had existed. However, now the safe was empty. But this alone isn't enough. I furrowed my brows. At that moment, Sandra stood up decisively. Perhaps this could be conclusive evidence. She pulled out her smartphone. "I haven't been able to show this email to anyone for a year," Sandra said, her fingers trembling as she operated the device. I was scared to think what might happen if Mrs. Dorothy Hanson found it among important documents. I read it once and then saved it on an old device. But I can't continue to betray Mr. Richard Hanson's wishes any longer. The sender was my father. The date was early in the morning on the day he died. "Sandra, I plan to meet with Jessica this evening. There are documents I want to give her. Just in case, I want you to also know where the copies of these documents are." The email included the location of a copy of the will. It was tucked away in the corner of the bookshelf, hidden inside my father's old diary. Found it. We carefully opened the diary. Indeed, there was a copy of my father's will sandwiched inside, dated 2 days before his death. It outlined the ownership of the company, the transfer of control to me, and the reasons for it. The diary also contained warnings about Dorothy. "This is definitive evidence," Nathan said, his face lighting up. "This proves that the will indeed existed." But that wasn't all. A thorough search of the study also turned up evidence of Dorothy's wrongdoing. My father's diary noted how she had forced him to sign documents she had brought in. The difference between the safe's inventory list and its current contents pointed to clear evidence of tampering. And then, the records of stock transactions. My father had been secretly tracking Dorothy's illicit dealings. 1 week later, a board meeting was convened. I arrived fully prepared, dressed in a dark blue suit and wearing the pearl necklace my father had given me. I entered the meeting room, where Dorothy wore her usual smug smile. But today, I had my father's support. The agenda for today is about the reorganization of the marketing department. The chairman began. Dorothy smiled contentedly. Before that, I stood up. "I would like you all to see this." The screen in the meeting room displayed detailed evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," I began in a steady voice, "I have gathered you here today to present significant evidence of illegal activities." The screen showed one piece of evidence after another. The email from my father to Sandra, the inventory list from the safe, the records of Dorothy's stock transactions. All of it pointed to her illegal activities. "This is fabricated." Dorothy raised her voice. "You made these up." But then, the door to the meeting room opened, and Lauren walked in, holding an envelope. "Let's stop the lies, Mom." Lauren's voice trembled. "This is the will you hid." The room fell silent. Dorothy's face drained of color. "Lauren, you." "I saw it," Lauren said, tears welling up. "That day, after Mr. Richard collapsed, I saw you taking documents from the study." The will extracted from the envelope clearly stated my father's intentions. "The ethos of this company lies in honesty and integrity. Only those who understand and can implement these principles should run it. My daughter Jessica has embodied this spirit since she was a child. The company rightfully belongs to her. Lauren continued. The ownership of the company belonged to Richard, and the right of inheritance is clearly stated to belong to Jessica, his blood relative. Dorothy, your actions are a clear violation of the law. The room erupted into chaos. It was now clear that the company and all rights to it would be transferred to me. Dorothy slumped into her chair. I admit it. Her voice was hoarse. I hid the will. Murmurs arose among the directors. The evidence was perfect. At last, my father's final wishes were brought to light. Jessica. Lauren called out to me as we were leaving. I'm sorry. I should have spoken about the truth sooner. I nodded quietly. Thanks to your courage, Lauren, we were able to show everyone my father's true intentions. The developments that followed were swift. An emergency board meeting was convened, and Dorothy's illegal activities were formally recognized. She was expelled from the board and legal proceedings were decided. She was charged with securities law violations, and during the trial, her past misconduct was revealed one after another. The prosecution presented evidence that she had attempted to take over 2 companies using similar methods in the past. In the case of her first husband's company, she tried to take control by buying shares under the guise of an anonymous investor but failed. The second time, she attempted the same with a partner's company but was not prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. The defendant's actions are clearly antisocial. The prosecutor sternly pointed out. Moreover, she betrayed the trust of the late Richard Hansen, engaging in illegal activities within just a year of his death. Throughout the trial, Dorothy's true character gradually came to light. Raised in a wealthy family, she developed an abnormal obsession with wealth and power following her father's bankruptcy. Her first marriage was also motivated by her partner's assets. Particularly shocking was the testimony about the truth behind Richard's death. Sandra, the former secretary, took the stand and disclosed crucial facts. On the day Mr. Richard Hansen fell ill, Mrs. Dorothy Hansen was unusually restless from the morning. Sandra recounted with a trembling voice, and just before Mr. Richard Hansen collapsed, she was muttering to herself, "I need to get these documents signed today." Although this testimony did not directly prove causality, it vividly illustrated Dorothy's character. The judgment was harsh. A 5-year prison sentence. The judge stated, "The defendant's actions have shaken the foundation of a business society based on trust." In prison, Dorothy lost all her former dignity. I visited her once. She spoke frankly, without pretense. "I have always lived my life striving to climb higher." Her voice was hoarse. "When my family went bankrupt, I was just 10. Since then, I believed that money and power were everything. But you had a daughter you loved." I challenged, but Dorothy smirked bitterly. "Lauren?" "Yes, indeed. But I only saw her as a tool to fulfill my ambitions. She knew that, and that's why she drifted away from me. She doesn't visit me." Lauren had separated from her mother and started her own small company. One day, she contacted me. We met in a hotel lounge. Being face to face with my former stepsister, she confided. "I want to change too," Lauren said. "Like you. I want to build something on my own. I want to step out from under my mother's shadow and live honestly." I smiled and responded, "Everyone has that opportunity. The important thing is to live honestly. That's the most important lesson my father taught me." New challenges awaited me. Many executives under Dorothy's influence announced their resignations, plunging the company into temporary chaos. However, this crisis brought new opportunities. I promoted capable young employees, including many who had been neglected by Dorothy. Thus, I continued my father's legacy and began to build a new management structure. Nathan remained by my side as my right-hand man, continuously contributing to the company's development. Most importantly, a new wind of hope began to blow within the company. A year later, the company recorded its highest performance ever. Now, a picture of my father hangs in my office. "Dad, our company is safe. It wasn't revenge we needed, but to build a better future," I said, smiling at his photo. I am Vanessa, a woman in my mid-30s. I work as an office clerk and lead a very regular life every day. My family consisted of 4 people: my mother, my sister Michelle, and our father, who recently passed away. From a young age, I felt a particularly deep bond with my father among my family members. He was a quiet and gentle man but became resolute when needed to protect us, always a reliable presence. His warm gaze and his quiet yet powerful words were always a source of support for me. I have countless memories with my father. Every Sunday, we would take care of the flower beds together in the garden. I vividly remember how he would lift me gently when I fell and cried at my elementary school sports day, and how he enjoyed taking photos more than anyone else during family trips. I particularly remember the day I first learned to ride a bicycle. Despite nearly falling several times, he never let go, supporting me throughout. That image of my father is an irreplaceable treasure for me. Even when I was troubled at work, he would say, "Vanessa, believe in what you want to do," encouraging me repeatedly. His words were always precise, pushing me forward strongly. Losing him was the greatest sorrow of my life. The grief that welled up from the depths of my heart was so profound that it felt like it was crushing me. My father passed away a few weeks ago. He had been in and out of the hospital for about a year due to illness, but the last few months were spent in continuous care at the hospital. The meals brought to his hospital room couldn't have tasted good to him. Yet, I vividly remember how he happily munched on the fruits we brought him. I visited his hospital room almost daily after work. Whenever I visited, he would greet me with a smile. Despite his frailty, the sight of his smile whenever he saw me was a great encouragement. He was always more concerned about my work and personal life than his own, but he had confided to my mother that he felt his physical strength declining and that it was hard. My mother, without telling me this, always supported him resolutely. She tried to alleviate some of his pain by massaging him and playing his favorite music. We had been told by the doctor that his time might be limited, so we thought we were prepared. However, when the time actually came, I couldn't accept the reality. When I witnessed his last moments in the hospital room, the serenity of him closing his eyes peacefully left a huge void in my heart. The warmth of my father, his gentle voice, and his smile seemed to have disappeared from my world forever. After the funeral, memories of my father remained vividly within me. Every time I returned home, I seemed to see his smiling face. Opening the front door, I would hear his gentle voice saying, "Welcome back," making me turn around again and again. Even during dinners with my family, I would suddenly think, "If only Father were here," and my heart would tighten. My mother was also grieving, but she tried to stay strong to support me and Michelle. I was always impressed by her strength. As for my sister Michelle, she seemed to handle the funeral and other procedures in a business-like manner, almost as if it were someone else's concern, which unsettled me. Michelle had always been a wild character, causing endless trouble for our parents. During her school days, she had been called to the school many times, troubling our parents. Nevertheless, they never gave up on Michelle and continued to shower her with love. Since marrying a man who works at a major bank a few years ago, she hardly visited our family home. At the wedding, I remember how my father looked at Michelle with genuine happiness. Even after our father's health declined, she stayed in contact but never visited. She couldn't have known how much our father missed her. However, she showed up on the day of the funeral, seeming more excited about the inheritance than saddened by our father's death. While we were overwhelmed with grief, Michelle was all about the inheritance, leaving me at a loss for words. Amidst all this, the discussion about dividing my father's estate began. One day, with a lawyer present, the whole family gathered to open my father's will. The atmosphere was somber, but I also felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety about what our father had left us. I wondered how his deep love would connect us. The lawyer began reading the will. First, it was revealed that the house and land were left to my mother, which was a natural outcome, and she quietly accepted it with a nod. Then it was announced that Michelle would inherit $130,000 in cash. Hearing this, Michelle chuckled and said, "As expected, Dad did the right thing." Her words carried no hint of sadness, only a focus on the money. Then it was my turn. I couldn't believe what the lawyer said next. "Vanessa will receive a cassette player." The last thing handed to me was just an old cassette player. I couldn't help but utter in shock. I couldn't understand what had happened and just stared at the lawyer. When I asked if there had been some mistake, the lawyer calmly replied, "This was your father's clear intention." Even after hearing this explanation, my doubts were not cleared, and I was simply bewildered. I couldn't comprehend my father's true intentions and was only confused. Michelle looked at the cassette player and sneered, "Can you even call that an inheritance?" Her insensitive words pierced deep into my heart. I couldn't understand why my father had left me such a thing, feeling completely disregarded. It felt as if I were worthless to him. Trying to calm me, my mother said gently, "Vanessa, your father must have had his reasons." However, those words only deepened the wound in my heart. If he had his reasons, why didn't he explain them to me? Receiving just an old cassette player, was I really cherished as his daughter? Such doubts began to arise, deeply hurting me. Was my bond with my father truly solid? These doubts wounded my heart deeply. I returned home and placed the cassette player on the table, staring at it intently. No matter how hard I looked, I couldn't feel that it was anything special. Sitting before what seemed like mere junk, anger and frustration swirled within me. Why only me? This thought dominated me. "Dad, why did you leave this to me?" Every time I voiced these words, my heart ached. I had thought that my father and I were especially closely bonded within our family. I remember how he spent a lot of time with me from my childhood. He would sit with me at the desk and solve problems together when I struggled with my studies, and we enjoyed walks just the two of us in the park on weekends. Following my father and talking about various things during those times was irreplaceable for me. Why had he left me such an unfair inheritance? Unable to accept it, I struggled to hold back the tears. Crying wouldn't bring my father back. I had to remind myself of that. However, I reconsidered, thinking, this is something my father left for me, and decided to check if it still worked. I pressed the power button and tried the play button, but the cassette player did not respond at all. Even when I inserted a cassette, there was no sound, not even the hum of the motor. It might be broken, I thought disappointedly, but I felt reluctant to just discard something my father had left me. I couldn't help but think that perhaps my father's love was hidden within this broken cassette player, and I couldn't bring myself to give up on it. The next day, I took it to a repair shop. When I explained to the clerk that it was not working and asked for repairs, they said, "It's quite old. It might take some time, but we'll take a look." As I left the cassette player at the shop and walked home, I was filled with mixed emotions. If this is meant to reveal my father's true intentions, could something be hidden within it? I wondered, but time passed without any answers. As I waited for the cassette player to be repaired, I found myself repeatedly thinking of my father and was overwhelmed by deep sadness. While waiting for the repair to be completed, I decided to continue sorting through my father's belongings. His room was filled with his favorite desk, bookshelf, and numerous photos of us as a family. Each time I touched these items, memories of my father vividly came back to life. In every photo, he had a gentle smile. Each time I remembered that smile, my heart warmed. One day, I found a cassette tape in an old box. It was labeled, "To Vanessa," in my father's handwriting. My hands trembled with surprise and emotion, and I hurriedly called the repair shop. "If the cassette player is fixed, I'd like to pick it up immediately," I said. The clerk replied, "The repair has just been completed," and I immediately went to the shop. A tape recorded with a message from my father. With anticipation and anxiety, my heart thumped loudly. When I got home, I immediately inserted the cassette and pressed play. After a moment of silence, my father's calm voice filled the room. Tears welled up in my eyes the instant I heard his voice, which sounded as if he were alive, gently echoing in my ears. "Vanessa, if you are listening to this, I am no longer in this world." His voice was nostalgic, as if he were speaking right in front of me. As I listened, my father's words deeply penetrated my heart. "Vanessa, thank you for everything. You've helped me in so many ways. Thanks to you supporting your mother and Michelle, I was able to spend my days in peace. But there's something I want only you to know. I've entrusted something very important to you. Please find it. It's in the storage shed." The moment I heard those words, my heart raced. What could this important thing that my father mentioned be? Although the cassette didn't specify the exact location, I was determined to find it, feeling that by doing so, I could reconnect with my father. From the next day, I began searching every corner of our house. My father's room, the storage shed, even the basement. These were all places he cherished, but I found nothing that seemed right. However, I didn't give up, and after several days of searching, I finally found a small safe in the back of the storage room. The excitement of finding the safe was indescribable. The safe matched the key to my father's desk, and I was able to open it immediately. Inside were several beautifully crafted antique watches, clearly the result of years of collection. The moment I opened the safe, I was breathless. The beautiful watches shimmered like jewels. Dad. I remembered seeing him wear these watches occasionally and couldn't stop my tears. Every time I looked at the watches, I was reminded of my father's gentle smile, which made my heart ache. I had the watch collection appraised by an expert, and it turned out to be worth over $500,000. At that moment, I felt as if I finally understood what my father had been trying to tell me. The true value of things is not measured by their appearance or price. Think about the meaning behind things. My father's teaching resonated deeply with me. I realized that my father had left me something truly valuable, not in terms of money, but in what really matters. This discovery was a poignant moment for me, but at the same time, I had no inkling of the turmoil that this collection would later cause. At that time, I had no idea that this event was just the beginning of a major upheaval that would involve my family. When I told my mother about it, she nodded quietly and smiled. "That's just like your father. I think he wanted to tell you something more than just money." Her words brought me some solace, but the calm did not last long. Her smile seemed to envelop me gently. A few days later, my sister Michelle visited our family home. My mother and I were living together at our family home, but she had moved out several years ago. As I was drinking coffee in the living room, Michelle entered somewhat forcefully through the front door and immediately said to me, "I heard that the watch collection is worth over $500,000. Is that true?" I was momentarily taken aback by her question, but thinking that lying was pointless, I replied, "Yes, that's what Dad entrusted to me." At that moment, Michelle's expression visibly changed and she frowned, her tone becoming more forceful. "Isn't that weird? We're sisters, so why is it so unfair? Dad's inheritance should be divided equally among us." I chose my words carefully and responded, "But this was something Dad entrusted to me through his will and a cassette tape. Michelle, you have $130,000 in cash. Isn't that enough?" However, Michelle showed no signs of being convinced. "That doesn't matter. I should have a right to that collection too." Her attitude, becoming more aggressive, left me at a loss for words. "Well, fine. I have work, so I'm going back, but I'll come again." With that, Michelle left our house. Her words deeply hurt me, filling me with anxiety. After that, Michelle frequently criticized me. Dad always treated Vanessa specially, or Vanessa always gets more, she would say, as if I were monopolizing everything. Michelle's words pierced my heart like thorns, causing me great distress. I didn't want to let her into the house, but since she also had a key to our family home, there was nothing I could do. I tried to respond to my sister as calmly as possible, but I gradually felt my spirit wearing down. Michelle's attacks cornered me mentally and left me exhausted both emotionally and physically. Michelle had always favored glamorous things, wearing luxury brands and enjoying meals at fancy restaurants had become her routine. With a sociable personality, she was always surrounded by people and loved attending glamorous parties. She had married a successful banker a few years ago and, on the surface, seemed to lead a wealthy and stable life. The initial years of her marriage were peaceful and happy. Her husband had a solid character, sincere in his work, and valued family. However, Michelle's spending habits remained unchanged, and after their marriage, she continued to buy luxury brands and frequently enjoyed overseas trips. At first, her husband tolerated her lavish lifestyle, but he gradually began to question it. "Michelle, shouldn't you consider saving a bit?" Every time her husband mentioned it, Michelle would laugh it off, saying, "I want to enjoy my life." However, his dissatisfaction built up over time, and gradually a cold atmosphere began to dominate their relationship. Michelle continued to prioritize her desires, ignoring her husband's concerns. During this period, Michelle started gambling. What began as mere fun quickly turned into a serious habit, as she began to gamble large amounts of money. As her losses accumulated, she kept telling herself, "Next time I'll win," and gambled even more. As a result, her debts ballooned to an amount she could no longer hide from her husband. No one was able to stop Michelle as she spiraled deeper into her gambling addiction. When her husband discovered the debts, their relationship completely broke down. Furious, he declared, "I can't overlook this any longer," and began to prepare for divorce. However, already burdened with a substantial amount of debt, Michelle found it difficult to manage without her husband's financial support. Desperate, she began to consider tapping into the family's assets. Abandoned by her husband, Michelle was financially cornered and placed in a desperate situation. One day when I returned home from work, I sensed something was off. An eerie silence enveloped the house, different from the usual. Just as I had suggested to my mother that we change the locks, although the front door was securely locked, something felt oddly misplaced. Glancing around the living room, I noticed a slight disarray at one corner of the shelf where my father's watch collection was displayed. The unnaturally empty space made me feel uneasy. A sense of foreboding washed over me, and I hurried to check the collection. Then, in the next moment, I was at a loss for words. Several watches had disappeared without a trace. I was struck by a chilling sensation. Could it be? For a moment, my mind was in turmoil, flooded with disbelief. Was it theft or just a misunderstanding? I searched every corner of the room, but the missing watches were nowhere to be found. With a sinking feeling, I opened a well-known online auction site. I entered the details of the watches and hit the search button. Among the search results displayed on the screen, I recognized one of the watches. The name of the seller was Michelle. This can't be. My hands trembled, and a lump formed in my throat. I couldn't believe that my own sister would try to sell our father's mementos in such a manner. I immediately called Michelle. "Michelle, what is this about? Did you take Dad's watches?" Michelle's voice was surprisingly calm. "You noticed quite quickly. It's family inheritance, so don't I have a right to it?" Struggling to contain my anger, I managed to say, "Those were precious items Dad entrusted to me. How could you take them without permission?" But Michelle was unapologetic. "Don't make such a big deal out of it. They're just antiques, right? If they're valuable, it's better to turn them into money," she retorted. Her words deeply wounded me, and I trembled with anger. At that moment, I realized that further discussion was futile. Hearing her refer to the watches, filled with our father's memories, as just antiques, made it clear that nothing I said would make a difference. I took a deep breath and made a quiet resolution. This could not go unresolved. I immediately reported the situation to the police. My father's legacy could not be trampled upon. I was resolute. The police quickly started an investigation and confirmed that Michelle had entered my home without permission and taken the watches. But that was not all. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that she had accumulated a huge gambling debt and was attempting to dispose of the family's assets illegally to pay it off. Michelle's crimes were far greater than she had imagined. The investigators carefully gathered evidence, and once the situation was clear, an arrest warrant was issued. A few days later, Michelle was arrested by the police. Michelle's arrest was a shocking event for me. I had never imagined my sister could become a criminal. When I heard that Michelle had been arrested, I felt a complex mix of emotions. While I was relieved that she would face justice, I also felt an indescribable sense of loss that our family bonds were completely shattered. Michelle's arrest left a deep scar on my heart. At the moment of her arrest, Michelle became frantic and tried desperately to resist. "Wait, this is a mistake. It's just a family issue." But the police calmly handcuffed her and stated firmly, "Your actions constitute theft." We'll discuss this further at the police station. Michelle continued to struggle, but as she noticed the stares from those around her, her face gradually paled. For the first time, fear and regret appeared in her eyes. Michelle's face was etched with despair. When I heard that Michelle had been taken to the police station, I let out a deep breath. While I had to accept this as fact, mixed feelings about whether this was the best outcome crossed my mind. Now that her crimes were revealed, it was only right that she be judged under the law, but I still could not completely sever the feelings I had for her as my sister. My heart was swirling with complex emotions. As the police interrogation progressed, the details of Michelle's crimes were gradually revealed. Not only had she entered my home without permission and taken the watches, but she had also illegally sold off family assets in the past and used the funds for gambling. There was also a suggestion that she had been involved in illegal transactions to repay her debts. Michelle's crimes far exceeded what anyone could have imagined. During the interrogation, Michelle repeatedly claimed, "I was just trying to share the family inheritance." However, her excuses did not hold up against the clear evidence. The police determined her actions to be a clear case of theft, and it was decided that she would be formally charged. Michelle's fate was to be judged by the law. On the day of the trial, Michelle stood in the courtroom, her demeanor uneasy, occasionally looking down. Her lawyer argued, "This is a family matter and too severe to be considered a criminal case." But the judge spoke sternly. "Your actions are not just a family issue. You betrayed trust and deliberately attempted to steal assets, which is a crime that cannot be overlooked socially." At those words, Michelle seemed to truly understand the gravity of the situation for the first time. She shivered, bit her lip, and struggled to hold back tears. Michelle's face was filled with regret and despair. Ultimately, Michelle received a suspended sentence. She avoided prison, but her record as a criminal remained, and her social credibility was completely lost. Michelle was shunned by society. After the trial, I met my mother outside the courthouse. She sighed quietly and murmured, "I never expected it to come to this." Her voice was tinged with the helpless feeling of a parent who has lost a child. My mother's heart was filled with deep sorrow. After receiving her guilty verdict, Michelle's life rapidly fell apart. The first thing that hit her was the collapse of her family. Michelle's downfall was something no one had anticipated. Following the public revelation of the trial's outcome, Michelle's husband decided he could no longer endure their life together and resolved to divorce her. Their relationship had already been cold, but with Michelle's crimes brought to light, her husband proceeded with the divorce without any sentiment. During the division of assets, he took a firm stance with his lawyers and left Michelle with almost nothing. Michelle was completely abandoned by her husband. As a result, she was forced to leave the luxurious home that was in her husband's name and moved into an old apartment in the suburbs. Michelle's life was completely transformed. Her new home was starkly different from her previous lavish lifestyle. The furniture was minimal, and due to financial constraints, she often couldn't afford heating. The days surrounded by luxurious dinners and high-end brands were behind her, and now she was reduced to hunting for specials at the supermarket. Michelle's living conditions had become drastically poorer compared to her past life. Michelle's financial situation continued to deteriorate. Burdened with overwhelming debt even after the trial, she found herself in a situation where she had to work incessantly, day and night. Juggling multiple part-time jobs and enduring long hours of labor, she was constantly chased by the need to pay off the interest on her debts. Michelle spent her days utterly exhausted. Amid this harsh lifestyle, Michelle's health began to decline as well. The glamour she once had completely vanished, replaced by a gaunt face deeply etched with fatigue. As she fell into despair, the friends who once surrounded her distanced themselves, leaving her utterly alone. Michelle had become completely isolated. There was one instance when she reached out through our mother for help, asking for just a little money. Her voice was no longer assertive but weak and fragile. My mother and I struggled for days with how to respond. Michelle is clearly desperate, but given her past actions, we can't be sure she would use the money wisely. My mother pondered this repeatedly, and I shared her concerns. Ultimately, we decided to respond by saying, "We won't provide money, but if you have specific problems, we can talk about them." However, after that, we received no further communication from Michelle. She couldn't accept our conditions. We hardly knew anything about Michelle's subsequent life. Occasionally, we would hear rumors about her continuing to work night shifts to pay off her debts and her increasingly difficult life. Gradually, Michelle faded from our memories. My mother and I rarely mentioned her name, while my mother reminded herself, "This is the path Michelle chose for herself." She occasionally showed a wistful expression. Her heart was filled with deep love for her daughter. One day, while dining with my mother, I mentioned, "I hope Michelle is doing well somewhere." After a moment of thought, my mother nodded slightly. "Yes, I hope so too." We never knew the details of what happened to Michelle afterward. Silently, I hoped that one day she would be able to turn her life around and atone for her past mistakes. I truly wished, from the bottom of my heart, that Michelle would find happiness one day,